today will be going through looking at a design for a new product and then redesigning that product live with you today. The reasons I'm doing this really is just give you an insight into what we do as UI designers, so show you some of the decision-making processes that we go through, try and drop a little bit of design knowledge in there and a bit of design theory, and all, I thought it'd be a little bit fun as well, a little bit novel compared to the type of talks that we've had today. So, well, no, different format, you know what I mean, like, a different format, a bit novel, a bit scary. So just a few disclaimers up front. This won't be all in real time. I've done a little bit of prep work and here's what I made earlier. So for all the product managers out there, if you do ask me to do a redesign in 20 minutes, it's just not going to happen. So bear that in mind. By all means, if I'll try not to use any jargon or any sort of like complex terminology, but if there is anything that I'm saying that you don't quite understand, then do feel free to sort of like stick your hand up and ask me. But I'll try and keep this sort of super basic, so everyone can understand and not too geeky as well. So because of the live redesign, I'll be sat down for this as well at my computer, so you don't need to look at me, you can look at the screen. So. Been through what we're going to go through, and we can get into our actual sort of task here. So this is our initial interface that we're going to be working with that's been supplied. It's a IT ticketing software used by the IT team to log service requests that come through from users, and it's sort of been put up in a way that tells them what their urgent tickets are, that they need to respond to certain tickets, and that new tickets have come through. It also gives them the ability to create new tickets on this dashboard as well. So those are our users, so we always, whatever we do, we want to keep our user in mind and what's most important to them. And we're looking at this interface here, and it's fine, it's a bit basic, it's a bit bland, it's quite cold, we have lots of sort of quite harsh lines, lots of very straight lines, so it's not very inviting, it's not very friendly. Furthermore, when we're talking about the user's needs, really there's not much separation between this content here, and it all looks really sort of quite the same. So at a glance, it's going to take a user a little bit of time to figure out what they need to do and how they need to do it. We want to change all that, so we want to make their user experience a lot easier, and then they can get their goals accomplished without much thought. Okay. So starting off, as a designer, the first thing we want to do is understand the context, so we've got that. We understand the user needs. We want to try and create a hierarchy for those needs, which I think we kind of have already, to be honest. So this bit up here is the at-a-glance stuff that we want the user to interact with first. We've got the information down here, which is still relevant to the individual user, but not quite as important. And then we have the information that's probably the least important down here, which is relevant to all users, but still needs to be known by our individual user. As well, we're also starting with a grid. So we can see there we've got sort of everything that fits in nicely into a 12-column grid. All design should function on top of a grid. Now, we do that so it helps us to organise space and to organise our components within that space to create nice bits of alignment. So everything should line up nicely, and it make it easier for the user to scan. So already we've got a couple of a good foundation to start our design on. So I'm just going to get rid of that. We can start taking a look at the actual design. Before we start moving things about, I just want to talk about typography. But currently we're using Helvetica, which is a fine font. It's a font you've probably heard of before. But for digital uses, it's not great. We can see here that it's sort of in large blocks. It tends to sort of, if I go a bit closer, it tends to sort of all sort of merge in together. The legibility is difficult. We're also using a lightweight font here. So legibility is reduced, making it difficult to, and also in all caps here, again, it becomes hard to read, it's a bit shouty, it's a bit hard. We can improve it with a typeface which is specifically designed for digital experiences. So here I've just swapped it out for a font called Proxima Soft. It's a typeface specifically designed for digital experiences, and already you can see the change in tone that creates. It's not quite as shouty, even though we're still using all caps. And it's a little bit softer, a little bit more friendly, and readability is much improved around here. So if you just compare it for what we have here, Again, a bit difficult. We need to sort of like typeset this a bit better. Whereas actually, straight off the bat here, we've got something that looks a little bit better. Also, in terms of design, we have this like really sort of big dark header up here, which is drawing all the attention more than we want to be drawn. So I'm just going to take that out. Of course, we can't see our text now, so I'm just going to change the colour of that. And you'll see I've also dropped that down to sentence case, making it a little bit easier to read and not quite as shouty. This here, tickets, that's our active page, so we want the user to be aware of that. So I'm just going to increase the weight slightly, not draw any attention, but make it clear that's the page they're on. We've also lost our button, so we want to go and change the colour of that, get it stand out, and we want to get rid of all these hard edges here. So this is something that I'm going to do throughout the whole of the design, is sort of soften the edges around the corners. So I'm going to take it to a full radius. We haven't got much space here, so I'm just going to increase it a bit. I'm also going to drop in an icon. Add a little bit of visual flair, but also reinforcing the meaning of that button as well. That you're adding something to, you're creating something new. Again, I just want to drop that down to sentence case. A little bit friendlier, a little bit nicer, and just get it all aligned. If you'll remember, we had a little link here as well, so I'm just going to use that. That links to the user's profile and shows the number of notifications they have, which to me is a little bit ambiguous. It's not quite clear what's supposed to be happening here, so I'm going to delete that and add in some new components. An avatar, show the user's face, and a notification icon. Here we're using components that the user should be familiar with, as there are existing design patterns in other type of products. As a designer, it's easy to sort of we naturally try and want to create things that are a bit more creative, a little bit more innovative. That's not always the best solution. Often, where we can, we'll fall back on established design patterns, meaning the user doesn't have anything new to learn. They should intrinsically already know how to use these. Of course, that's something we'll always test as well, that they are easy to understand and they're easy to use. So that's our header sorted. Next, we're going to move on to our tiles here. So, as I mentioned earlier, this is our primary focus for the user, and this is a bit we want them to look at first. Now, what we've done now when we remove this header is that we have an awful lot of white space, and you'll often hear designers talk about white space like it's their best friend. We like lots of space, so everything looks nice and clean, but I think we just have a little bit too much here, and there's no clear separation, and these tiles really don't stand out that much. So what I'm going to do is drop in a background behind them and change the colour. And in the gradient, so we start with dark over here, moving into the light. Now doing that, not only does it create a little bit of impact and draw the user's focus, but it creates a little bit of texture and a little bit of depth, bringing more focus to our cards here. And you can see how much the white cards stand out on top of that blue now. So already an improvement there. With these cards, we're going to do the same thing as I spoke about before, soften those corners and add in a drop shadow, which you can just see lifts it off the background very, very slightly and very subtly, giving it a little bit more prominence. We will go look at the typography here and try and get this a little bit more unified and a little more balanced. Because at the minute, nothing's really standing out apart from this big title here. Again, it's just a little bit too shouty. So we're going to drop that down. And in this instance, I'm going to put that back into uppercase. In this instance, it creates a little bit more authority as a title and doesn't need to be as shouty as it was when it's a bigger text. And now next we're going to look at this number. Now we swapped it to Proximus Soft, which I said previously is a lot softer, a lot more friendlier. But in this instance, it looks a little bit too friendly, almost childish. And we want these tiles to have a little bit of authority to them. So in this case, I'm going to change it to Proxima Nova, in the same family of type, but has the more traditional squared off terminals, which users are more used to seeing. So we just get them nice aligned, and then we're going to take out this call to action and drop in a new button. Likewise, we drop in an icon, give it a little bit more meaning, a little bit more visual flair, and drop in the uppercase on the button as well. Still, we have a problem here where it's difficult to differentiate between these tiles as to the purpose of each tile. So I'm going to start introducing some colour here, but before I do, I just want to sort of talk a little bit of colour theory. Nothing too heavy, so that's okay. So we can see that there's a lot of shades of red. Anyone who's done any decorating will know there's no one shade of any particular colour, but more like 25. So how do we pick a colour? Well, it's really helpful that we have tools like this where we can just go through and look at them, and we can pick out our colours. And it involves a lot of trial and error to see what works. We have lots of colours here. In this instance, since we're using quite a small icon, we could afford to be a little bit more bold with it, a little bit more brighter. So we have this one here. Now, how do we now take that and turn it into more colours? Because what we're going to do with these is create a traffic light system here, which is super helpful for our users, because that already has real world connotations. They know what red, green and amber mean. So for these urgent tickets, we're going to drop in a red, and which I've already started to play with. Yeah, but then we need to create colours for our green and our amber, which can be quite tricky. To make that easier for us, we're going to focus on these values here, which are hue, saturation and brightness. Now, hue affects the type, what colour you're picking, whether that's purple or green. Saturation is this value here that starts off at the brightest all the way down to the lightest. And brightness should be fairly self-explanatory, from the darkest to the brightest. So we can start doing that here. We can retain on these colours the same saturation, the same brightness, only changing the hue. That then starts to give us a family of colours which starts to look harmonious together and part of the same family. We can take that a step further to create these background colours, which are a little which look like they've reduced opacity. But all we've done on this is change the saturation. So they retain the same values in hue and brightness, but we just drop that saturation right down to give us a nice background for our icon to sit on. And you can see there, we're going to have clear differentiation between these tiles, and we can start to create a relationship between colours. So new is always just green up here. And we'll see that sort of implemented later on in the UI. Before I go any further, I just want to talk about the background colour. So currently we're using a solid white, which is great because it's clean and it gives good contrast for our content to sit on. In digital experiences though, we don't always want to use solid white. In large spaces like this, it can cause a little bit of strain on the eyes, making it difficult, making readability on the text a little bit difficult. So we're just going to change that and saturate it with a little tiny blue and just soften that a little bit while we're maintaining that really good contrast we have on this text. So next we're moving on to our table down here. As we said previously, this is sort of our secondary information that's still really important to the user, but not quite as important up here. We have it in the table at the minute, which is helpful. Tables are good for displaying data, they're good for capturing data, but if we want the user to make decisions at a glance and to just make decisions quickly, then tables aren't quite the best medium for this. So I'm just going to move this to the side. Give this a little bit of a treatment. I'll get rid of that now. Okay. Now what I want to do in this, rather than a table, I want to display these as actual support tickets. So we can create similar styles as above. And again, rounded those corners, giving it a drop shadow, and you can see how much that white now stands against a very, very subtle blue background. We want to start thinking about hierarchy as well, as we did with these styles up here. What information do we want the user to focus on first? And in my opinion, that's the subject, as well as the status of the ticket. So I'm just going to bump that text up a bit. Again, so we're using hierarchy to define what's important. And with this, I'm going to start using the same colours that we defined up here to call out the status, hopefully, without clashing too much with the title. So they both retain quite equal prominence, but they don't clash with each other. Now that we start to use the text in these colours, we're sort of kind of noticing a bit of a problem that we didn't consider when we define them, and they don't quite work. You can see, whereas on these icons, they're nice big shapes, they work quite well on the backgrounds. With text, not so much. We've got an issue here where the contrast isn't quite prominent enough, and for most users, it'd be quite difficult to see that or to read it properly, even users without visual impairments. So this is something that we need to take into consideration and rectify, which we can do quite easily. We've got tools like Colour Review, which help us define accessible colour palettes. So you can see up here straight away, even we didn't need to tell anyway, because it's very difficult to read, but these fail accessibility standards. The really cool thing about this tool is that we can then just hold this and bring it down, and we can see that it starts to pass on headlines and even on smaller text, and we can get that right down to AAA compliance, where all users should be able to easily read that. The great thing about that is we've just adjusted the brightness, so the hue and saturation remain the same, meaning that it still sits within that family of colours, and it still retains that harmonious look that we've tried to develop. So if I swap that out now with one that I made earlier, we can see there that's so much more legible, and it doesn't stick out and still feels part of that same family of colours. So we've got that sorted now. We can look at our secondary information, which is the name of the user who submitted a ticket and the department they're from. What I want to do with these is I want to sort of combine the data into real world language to give it more meaning to the user. I also want to make these into links. So we can define a specific colour just for links, like we've done with these buttons up here, giving meaning to the colour, and so the user can learn the interface a bit quicker. We then have our sort of least important information, the date it was logged, and the ID. I say these are still important bits of information, but we don't want them as prominent as we do the other bits. So we can change the colour on those. They're still legible, they're still accessible, but then not quite as prominent as a text here. Now in doing that, we've got a bit of an issue where we've got two numbers in very, very close proximity to each other. This could potentially cause a little bit of cognitive overload, where it's difficult to determine what the number is and what meaning it has to the user. So I'm going to get rid of this date format and change it into, again, real world language. Just make it easier. So we say that was logged today, that was logged yesterday, that was logged 2 days ago, 3 days ago, 1 week ago. I think we have a little bit of a better looking card there. We need a button for it though. Again, I'm just going to change the text on that, so rather than view, where it's quite shouty and quite sudden, I'm just going to add the view ticket, make it a little bit more human. Add the blue link. And I want to drop in an icon again. So you can see we're starting to develop a bit of a visual language here that's sort of going through the entirety of our user interface, giving it a consistent look and feel, and hopefully letting the user sort of learn the interface quickly and achieve their goals a little bit easier. So if we just go here, you can see that we've got them laid out in a row of 6 here. Looking quite nice. One little touch that I've made here is to make them look like a real world ticket, is to add these little notches in here, give them just a little bit. So that's just a little extra flourish, a little creative flourish on that, just to give a little bit of distinction to show this is the button, and that's why we've added a little blue background as well. And we can see now that we've got how the buttons, how the status there are pulling the cards out and giving them purpose and the meaning. One thing though that we haven't really talked about is how these extra design flourishes are pushing the content down a little bit and creating a little bit more vertical space. So just to combat that, I've added in a gradient here that gives us a little bit more space down below and doesn't mean the user has to scroll quite as much. This little gradient here creates a little bit of affordance where we're kind of hiding the information, but really not. So the user knows that they can easily get to it through this button here. And then lastly, we have this table down here, and this shows all tickets that are currently logged and need action. Like I said, this isn't the most important part of the page, but we still need to give it some consideration. In this instance, I think a table probably is the right medium to be showcasing this data, but it's still not the prettiest looking thing, and it's still not the easiest to understand at a glance. We've got our lines here, which are creating a bit of visual noise. It all looks a little bit samey, so what can we do to address that? Okay, so I'm going to put in a rectangle. And we can start to use some of that visual language that I keep talking about. Yeah, so we've rounded the corners. We've added that drop shadow with the white background on the rectangle so it stands out, and giving a bit of a subtle colour to the hair there. Likewise, in these tiles up here, I've kept this text uppercase just to give it a bit of authority. And we can start to use some of the design decisions that we've currently made in the rest of the interface to improve how data is presented here. So we can add in avatars, like we've done at the top. We can add in our, we can start to combine data like we have here. So we can combine maybe the title with the ID number and the user who's logged the issue with their department. Okay, and then we can add in our status pills like we have here. And add in our date as real language as well. So straight away you can see how much easier it is to look at that table and decipher it and to take the appropriate action that the user needs to take. We've still got a bit of an issue with a lack of separation here, so it's not necessarily easy for the eye to follow straight across. So we can just drop in some very, very subtle colouring behind those rows. Again, just so it's easier for the eye to follow it straight across and not deviate from that information. And then we've got a much nicer table. I think it's worth noting as well that I've taken quite a few design liberties here with from the original design. Now, if we were doing this for MoneySuperMarket, the way we would do it is we'd work collaboratively. So I wouldn't go away and make these decisions all by myself because I think they look better. I would consult with the researchers, I would consult with the UX designers, and we would make those decisions together as a collaborative endeavour. So there we have the finished UI, and I personally think that's a lot better than what we originally had. So if we go back to here, again, yeah, so we have our original one here. We can see how cold it looks, how nice it looks, how difficult it is to comprehend this data. So our UI here, which has a little bit more personality, as well as it's easier for the user to accomplish their goal. Now, as designers, we usually don't tackle desktop first, but for this instance, I thought it'd be easier to explain the concepts I was trying to communicate. But if you're wondering how it looks on mobile, this is how it would look. Again, using all the same elements that we had here, we've got that idea of affordance here, where the user understands how to interact with it. And we've reduced the content on this table a little bit, just to make it a little bit, to fit it in. We also consider the interactions the user might make. So what happens when the user hovers on something? Well, that's what happens. What happens when they create a new ticket? Well, we get this form. So that's the redesigned interface. So generally, the things I want to sort of take away from this, when you're considering visual design, is to consider the context and the content first. You can't make any design decisions without considering them. You need to understand your user, you need to understand their goals and what they're trying to achieve. You need to understand the content so you can change it in ways that are more meaningful or you believe are more meaningful. And without doing that, you can't establish a hierarchy. You need to understand the context and the content first before you establish a hierarchy. And we know a hierarchy is important because if everything stands out, then ultimately nothing does. So we want to understand what we need to make the primary focus and what we need to probably make have the least focus on. And we can do that using type. So all designers, as designers, we need to consider type first. How it's used, how it affects the tone of the website and the products you're creating, and the same with colour as well, how that affects it, and how we create colour palettes that are accessible, that have a harmonious feel to them, and how we assign meaning to colour to help the user make better decisions and quicker decisions. And lastly, something I touched on quite briefly is the familiar versus the novel. We constantly walking the line between creating experiences that feel familiar, that are easy for the users to learn, but also trying to push innovation and create designs that feel creative and feel fun and that users want to interact with. So yeah, there we go, that's my talk. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jamie. Appreciate that. Thank you very much. There's no questions on slide. Okay.